come do this 3-part series with us. Welcome, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. So just confirm that this is up and running. Yeah, just go up there. Good. I'm going to apologize to people who are on Zoom. I have this tendency to move when I talk. And so I won't always be in front of the camera, but you should be able to hear me. That's generally never been a problem for me. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me. I feel like there are many old friends in the room and new friends that I hope to make in the room. As somebody who now lives in Boca and is going to be, already am, but running and opening a school down in Miami. So this is a space right in between the two. So I hope this will be the first of many opportunities we'll have to learn together, to learn from each other over the coming months and years. The topic for this mini series is the life and times of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Are we not?
We are going to give you a better watch. I just keep going.
Okay. And so this is a or who he was or what he did, but taking you behind the scenes and into the process that we historians use to make our determinations about who a person was and how they lived their lives. And tonight in particular, we're going to take on one aspect of the young Netziv's life, one that has been quoted and requoted and told over countless times in countless places across the world. And we're going to put our historian's hats on for the evening and try to discover what we can about the historical facts, right, behind the legend. If we want a definitive description of the Netziv with regard to the world of Torah in general and the world of the yeshiva in particular, it would be this, that he was the king of the Rosh Yeshivot and the father of all B'nai HaYeshivot. The king of the Rosh Yeshivot and the father of all B'nai HaYeshivot, that is a rather lofty description. That is the way the Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was described in the immediate aftermath of his life, the turn of the 20th century. That is the way he was viewed, and indeed, he certainly deserves to be up there amongst the pantheon of the most influential, the most highly celebrated minds and personalities of 19th century Jewish world. As I said a moment ago, what I want to do with you this evening in particular is to delve into one particular piece of the Netziv's early life. But in order to do so, I need to set the stage for you a little bit, kind of give you some of the bookends, the beginning and the end, right? And then we'll come back and sort of roll up our sleeves as historians and dig into this particular episode. So Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who probably was not called Rabbi when he was born, but born in a small shtetl called Mir, in what is today Belarus. You can see pictures of it on page 2. Not so easy to see. One of the things I always love to point out when I bring people into the world of Eastern Europe, if you look at that second picture on the bottom, right, this is true about Mir, and it's true about just about every other shtetl, and yet somehow kind of think it escapes the Jewish popular imagination when we think of the shtetl. What is the most prominent building in every shtetl? The church, of course, right? Of course. And basically the way shtetlach came about is the shtetlach were there to service the Russian peasantry who worked the land. Right, so they worked the lands, and then they would come in on Sundays to go to church where Jews would provide them with all the various needs that they had, right? They would sell them what needed to be sold. They'd be their goldsmith and their coppersmith, and and any other, they'd be their tailor. Right? That's what Jews did. That's what a shtetl was. It was a service station, right, for the countryside. And so you would come in for the church. So you had this kind of funny situation where you could have 80-90% of the inhabitants were Jews, right? But the leading structure in the town was always the church, because that's what it was there to do. So he's born in a small town called Mir, to a family. His father was a somewhat successful merchant. Seems to have been a Talmud Chacham also. At a young age, the young Netziv, the young Naftali, Tzvi, Yehuda, Berlin leaves Mir for the even smaller shtetl of Volozhin. Now, Volozhin on a map, may not look that far away, but I think I Google mapped it here. It took about 2 hours and 4 minutes by car if you would drive it today. Right? Volozhin being somewhere between Minsk and Vilna. But imagine doing that trip on with a horse and carriage. Right? It probably takes a good deal longer than 2 hours and 4 minutes. It's pretty far away, right, from the town that he was born in. So what brings the little Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin to Volozhin? Well, it is the presence there of a yeshiva. Yeshiva known as Yeshiva Eitz Chaim, which later becomes known by the town itself, right, the Volozhiner Yeshiva. What attracts him to the Volozhiner Yeshiva? Well, the Volozhiner Yeshiva is, at that point, really one of a kind. It represents a revolution in the world of Torah learning, one that really changed the entire trajectory of how we educate our children, our young men in particular, in the Jewish world. It was founded in 1803 by the person who was then the rabbi, the rabbi in Volozhin, the Chaim of Volozhin. The Chaim of Volozhin is often referred to as the great student of the Vilna Gaon, of the Gra. It's a bit of a misnomer. The Vilna Gaon didn't have students. The Vilna Gaon wasn't a teacher. So if you're not a teacher, you don't really have students. The Vilna Gaon never had any official position in the town of Vilna. He was not the rabbi of Vilna. He did not have a yeshiva in Vilna. The Vilna Gaon spent the vast majority of his time in isolation, studying and writing notes. He never served in any official capacity as a teacher. There were a select few of the brightest young men who were given an audience with the Vilna Gaon, generally for a maximum of 2 weeks over the course of a year. And Chaim of Volozhin was one of those, right? and probably the best known of them, or the most accomplished of them thereafter, and therefore he's referred to as the great student of the Vilna Gaon. It's just important that we kind of recalibrate what we think of as a student, right, when we call him that. Chaim of Volozhin comes back to Volozhin in 1803, and he starts this yeshiva. What was the revolution of Volozhin? The revolution of Volozhin was as follows. Up until this point, when you said you went to yeshiva, right, what did that mean? A yeshiva in the world of pre-19th century Europe generally meant a room annexed to a shul, probably looked something like that, right, in which the rabbi of the town would give shiurim to young people over the course of a day. To go to study at someone's yeshiva meant you were going to the town of a rabbi, a community rabbi who was known for their learning, and you wanted to study with them. So you would go to that town. There was no facility. There was certainly no dormitory. There was no dining room. There were no classrooms. Right? Sometimes you'd learn in the actual sanctuary. Sometimes there was a room annexed next door. Where would you live? You would live in the town. And you would board at somebody's house. How were you supported? Well, you would be supported by the person that you lived with. They would give you a place to sleep. And then you would do what's called, you would essen tug. You would eat a different day. You would be assigned to a different person's house, somebody who had enough means that they could also give, right? They could spare some extra food, and you would eat at each of their houses. Obviously, if you had something to pay, you would pay. If not, you didn't. If you were good enough, and that's what a yeshiva was up until 1803. The vision that Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin had, and beyond the scope of this of this lecture to talk about how and why it came about. But the vision that he had was for an institution that would actually stand on its own 2 feet. Or in other words, if you have ever had a mishulach come to your door raising money for a yeshiva, you have Chaim of Volozhin to thank. Okay? He is the one who invented that idea, and the idea basically went as follows. Up until that point, a yeshiva was only as good as the town that it belonged to, right? And it only lasted as long as the particular shul rabbi was interested in giving shiurim, and there were community members who could support these young boys. The vision of Chaim of Volozhin, how for an institution that would stand on its own 2 feet, that would raise money from outside the world of Volozhin, that would say, we're going to bring the best boys together to learn from the best minds, Tamidei Chachamim, people who didn't have necessarily an additional job to be the community rabbi, although Chaim of Volozhin was both Rosh Yeshiva and the Rav of the town. But we would bring other staff who would be focused just on our young boys. We would bring the best minds. They would be able to focus, right? They would pay if they could, but if they couldn't pay, we were going to raise the money for them so that, yes, they would still stay in somebody's house, but we would pay those people to house this young man, right? So that this could be viable over time, rather than depending on the largesse of the particular community. And that is how the Yeshiva Eitz Chaim emerged. Sorry, Yeshiva Eitz Chaim in Volozhin emerged, and it became the paradigm for all yeshivos that followed. So you probably know Mir because today Mir is a great yeshiva in Yerushalayim, right? But Mir then didn't have a yeshiva. Mir will have a yeshiva by the middle of the 19th century, modeled after Volozhin. Slobodka will have a yeshiva that is modeled after Yerushalayim, after Volozhin. Later on in the century, right? Telz will have a yeshiva that's modeled after Volozhin. So that is what brings the young Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin to Volozhin. It is the presence of this yeshiva. Now, the interesting thing about the Netziv's life is that it isn't terribly interesting. He comes to learn Volozhin, and he stays there for the rest of his life. He actually leaves in 1893, primarily on a fundraising mission. The yeshiva was in bad straits at the time, but he falls ill on that trip. He's there with his son, I believe, Chaim Berlin. He falls ill. He gets medical treatment there in Warsaw. Ultimately, he passes away. Today, if you want to visit the kever of the Netziv, it is there in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, actually buried next to his granddaughter's husband, the famous Chaim Brisker. That's his life story. Right? Comes to Volozhin as a young man, stays there his entire life, ultimately leaves to get to Warsaw, and there he passes. Obviously, he does quite a bit in between. So let's skip to the end of the story, and then we're going to come back. So what does he leave us? What is the Netziv's great legacy? What is it that he gave the world of Jewish learning? Well, let's start with the publications that he gave us, the Torah that he gave us, and you can find that on page 12. So if you look at the list on the top of page 12, so the text that most people associate with Netziv, the entry point for most people into the world of the Netziv, and it was certainly mine, is his Perush on Chomesh HaAmigdal. The Netziv was very clear that was not his proudest work. His magnum opus, the piece that he worked the longest on, that he was most proud of, was the first work that he published, Ha'amik She'ala or Ha'amik She'ila. Ha'amik She'ila is a work, it is a commentary, it's a massive and brilliant commentary on a Geonic halachic work known as the She'iltos of Rav Achai Gaon. If you're not familiar with the She'iltos of Rav Achai Gaon, you're not the only one. Right? It wasn't something that was terribly widely studied prior to the Netziv, or quite honestly, since the world of the Netziv. But if there was a base medrash that has a She'iltos in it, you would have the She'iltos today with the commentary of the Netziv, with the Ha'amik She'ila. It is the version that is out there today. Why and how he decided to go in that direction, to study that, that's something that may come up a little bit next week. His work Make Davar, that is his Perush on Chumash. It is born out of the shiurim that he would give, in this way, something that the Netziv, actually his father-in-law, Rav Yitzchak started doing it before him, but he would give a daily Chumash shir, which was also different than what you would find in most yeshivos. He would give a Chumash shir on the parsha, right, each week, and much of that became the basis for his Perush on Chumash, known as Make Davar. The other things that he published in his lifetime were the next two on that first row, Rina Shel Torah, which is a commentary on Shir HaShirim, which has a fascinating essay on the roots of anti-Semitism at the end of that Perush, and then his Perush on the Haggadah, Imrei Shef. Immediately after his death, his children will collect his tshuvos and publish them as Meishiv Davar. And then you can see there's a long break. Right? It's not to the middle of the 20th century that his descendants will publish the rest of his unpublished manuscripts, including Meromei Sadeh, Emek HaNetziv, which is a perush on the Sifrei, and Birkat HaNetziv, which is a commentary on the Mechilta. We know that he was constantly going back to these works throughout his life, updating them, editing them. As you can see from the manuscript that's there in the bottom, this is, I was able to get in, locate the manuscripts to his perush on the Sifrei. They are held by his family in Geula. Unfortunately, they sit rotting on a shelf. But longer story, but I was able to get in to see them, not for nearly as long as I had wanted to. But one of the things that's very clear when you look at it is you can see that he will cross out. Right, he'll go back, he'll cross out something. In fact, the one that you have here on this page, I think the original there said Yesh Lomar, I think, and you can see he crossed it out and wrote Bivadai, right? So something that he was, he was unsure about when he was younger, and went back and crossed it out and said, yeah, no, now I'm sure. But this was his style. This is the way in which he composed his Sfarim. If you turn the page to page 13, we begin to look at not the books he left us, but the people that he left us. We'll talk about the Epsteins in just a few minutes, but you can see from his own progeny, as so often happens, complicated, nuanced people leave us progeny who often take a piece of that complicated, nuanced person and sort of run with it, right? And I think that when you look at his two sons, both of whom have institutions named after them today, you can begin to get some sense for kind of who he was and how they each took his legacy and went in kind of different ways. So what are the two institutions named after his children? So you have the Yeshiva Chaim Berlin, right, in Brooklyn, and Bar Ilan University, right? Two very different places of Jewish learning. Fascinatingly, at least this is what is recorded, is that Yeshiva Chaim Berlin took on the name Yeshiva Chaim Berlin at the urging of Meir Bar Ilan, who after Chaim Berlin's passing urged the yeshiva, I forget what the original name of the yeshiva was, right, to name the yeshiva after his late brother. But Meir Bar Ilan and Chaim Berlin, very, very different people, actually born of different mothers. They were probably about 50 years apart, 40, many, many years apart. And had different outlooks, both Talmidei Chachamim, but ultimately that sort of world, Meir Bar Ilan was one of the architects of the religious Zionist movement, right, and ultimately has a university named after him, right? And Chaim Berlin, who is, which was yeshiva, created, some of the great gedolim of the 20th century. Both of those kind of reflect back on who he was. And if you flip the page, the same is really true about his students. The Netziv produced some of the greatest minds, or I should say some of the greatest minds of the late 19th century into the 20th century were students of the Netziv, and that includes both the greatest minds within the yeshiva world and those outside of the yeshiva world. So you have great gedolim like Rav Chaim Ozer and Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, who was the head of Slobodka, and Rav Shimon Shkop, who I understand we have a Talmud of a Talmud of a Talmud, right, here with us this evening. Rav Kook, It was a great Talmud of the Netziv, and yet there were others. People like Abraham Harkavy, who was the historian and librarian at the Imperial Library, right, in St. Petersburg. Micha Yosef Berdichevsky, who was one of the great secular Yiddish writers of the late 19th century, and Chaim Nachman Bialik, who we all know, right, is one of the great secular poets, right, Hebrew poets of the 20th century. All of them pointed back to the Netziv as a formative and formidable force in their young lives. So, the question that I want to explore with you this evening is not so much what did the Netziv become, but where did he come from? And I pause here because I really do hesitate before I give this lecture, because my goal is not to undo or take away from something which I think has inspired many young people for quite some time. But I do want to get to the truth. That is important to me. And sometimes I think the truth can be as inspiring, sometimes as the myth might be also. So what am I referring to? What I'm referring to is that in just about every yeshiva, right, across the world, if you study there long enough, you will hear somebody at some point get up and tell the story of the shoemaker. Right? The story of the shoemaker. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Everybody knows it. Everybody tells it because it's inspiring. Because if I flip back on my educator's hat right now, I want to tell the story because I wanted to inspire my kids the way that many others have told it to theirs. So let's read the story of a shoemaker. I gave you two different versions of it, one from H.com, the other from the Yeshiva World on page 4. The Eish Rabbi replies, allow me to share a story. The Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, lived in Lithuania a few hundred years ago. He was the most famous rabbi of his generation, and said that in the 40 years that he headed the yeshiva in the town of Volozhin, some 10,000 students studied there. The Netziv wrote commentaries on all parts of the Torah, and once when he published a particularly difficult work called Ha'emek Shela, he called together his friends for a special celebration where he told them the following story. When I was a child, I never paid attention in school. I was lazy and did not want to concentrate. Right? You see why we educators like the story, right? So one day when I was 11 years old, I came home from school and heard my parents talking. My father was explaining how he'd spoken to my teacher, and together they concluded that I'd never amount to anything in terms of scholarship. So my father explained he was arranging to enroll me as an apprentice shoemaker as soon as I became bar mitzvah. I was so shocked by this conversation that I ran to my parents and exclaimed, I'm sorry I've been negligent with my studies. Please give me one more chance to prove that I'm a good student. And from that day onward, I applied myself to the study of Torah with tremendous vigor and dedication. Since then, I have not wasted a moment, and it is that devotion which has enabled me to write the commentary which we are celebrating today. Then the Netziv continued, but just imagine what would have happened had I not overheard my parents' conversation. I probably have ended up as a shoemaker. And I'd have been a pretty good shoemaker besides. But think of what would have happened at the end of my life when I get up to the heavenly court and they'd ask me, Naftali, show us what you've done with your life. And I'd proudly show them my beautiful shoes, the fine workmanship, the quality leather, and exquisite design. And then they'd ask me, but Naftali, where are all the books you were to publish? Where are your 10,000 students? And then the Netziv continues. And what would I possibly respond? Version 2. Says the Mashgiach Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz Zatzal, that if a person has a talent that he is capable of doing, as long as he is capable of doing the task on hand, it is as if Hashem commanded him to do so. When Netziv completed his work on the She'ildot, after many years of working on it, he made a Seudah. He got up at the Siyum and started crying. He related that when he was a little boy, he was having a very hard time in yeshiva, as he would struggle daily just to understand what the Rebbe was saying. It's a little different than the first version. One night he overheard his parents talking, and they were saying that they were paying so much for his schooling, and yet he just wasn't grasping it. His father wanted him to learn a trade, so at least he could grow up and have a living while staying in Erlich Yid. He wanted him to be a shoemaker. Upon hearing this, he ran out of the room and begged them for one more chance. He said, let me try a little harder, and I will do my best to succeed. Says the Netziv, imagine had I become an Erlich shoemaker, I would have been God-fearing about tzedakah, and I've opened my home for chesed, that when I would have passed and come to Shemayim from Kisei HaKavod, they would have pulled out my Sfarim and asked Naftali, where are they? Now, Baruch Hashem, I can come up there with this completed Perush. I made the effort and was capable of writing this extensive work. Okay. So I can't tell you how many times, I don't really know the answer, but how many times early on in my work on the Netziv, after I had written my dissertation on him, I published the book, and so people began associating me with the Netziv. So I would get this question, and people would ask me, is it true? Is it true? So let me ask you guys, put on your historian hats. How would you answer? How would you go about figuring that out? How would you go? Where would you look? How would you answer the question? How would you try and answer the question? Is this true? Yes, what would you do?
His memoirs, his own personal memoirs, memoirs of people who taught him. I don't know.
Okay, good. So we'd look back at anything that he may have written about his own child, right? And so we would check there for sure. Good. If there was something that was left to us by his teachers, that would be fantastic also. Okay, those would be good sources. There aren't, to the best of my knowledge. We do have stuff that he wrote about himself, but not anything from his teachers. That's good. What else? Anything else? Huh? Ask his mother. Always a good answer, right? Yeah, unfortunately, his mother didn't leave us anything either. But if we could have, I certainly would have asked her. Anything else? Oh, yeah. Okay, right. So we trace the story back, right, and see what are its origins, how far back does it go, who is the source, right, and how trustworthy, right, is that source? How well did this source know, right? The early life of the Netziv. That's a great one. Anything else? Oh, okay. I was waiting for somebody to say that. Yes, right. Except if this is a Jewish history lecture, right? You're right. When I put on my education cap, it really doesn't matter. Right? It's an inspiring story. It's funny. After I did this the last time, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Well, it's like they say about the Chavetz Chaim, right? They tell these stories, but they don't tell the story about you and me." Like reverse, right? Usually it's the Gedolim stories where they're all brilliant when they're young, right? And we ask, is it true or not? And we say, I don't know. They don't tell the story about me, you and me. So let's leave it at that, right? But this is exactly the reverse. This is what they say about, well, I don't know about you, about me. He was average. He wasn't so special. Okay, right? That's what's strange about it, right? Is how do you get this Gadol who produces tremendous farim that are still studied to this day? Right? Has students who are the leading minds, and yet the story that comes out about him is that wasn't the most smart, average kid, right? To begin with, not struggled in school, right? Okay, so I think all the suggestions here were good ones. We're going to try and do just about everything that was said. So how far does the story go back? The answer to that question is I don't know. I don't know what the earliest version of that story is because it's largely told, right, Baal Peh, right? It's largely told orally, right, from teacher to student, and they retell it. But I do think I know where the origins of this story come from, where this theme first emerges, that the Netziv wasn't anything terribly special when he was young, and that comes from a work known as the Makor Baruch. The Makor Baruch is a 4-volume memoir left to us by Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein. Now, it is probably best known to the English-speaking American crowd by a translation of a small section of this work that came out in the late 1980s that was called, anybody know? Yes, very good. Okay, My Uncle the Netziv. So this was written by the Makor Baruch, by Baruch Halevi Epstein, and indeed the Netziv was his uncle, that is, the Netziv's sister married Baruch Halevi Epstein's father. Baruch Halevi Epstein's father was Anybody? The Aruch HaShulchan, yes, good. Rav Yechiel Michal Alevi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan. Right? So the Aruch HaShulchan was married to the Netziv's sister. So that makes Baruch Alevi Epstein, right, the Netziv's nephew. Gets more complicated though, because when the Netziv's first wife dies, he remarries his niece, which makes Baruch Alevi Epstein his brother-in-law also, right? So both nephew and brother-in-law both right. Okay, but my uncle Netziv was a translation of one piece of this 4-volume memoir called Makor Baruch that was about the life of his uncle, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. Now, my uncle Netziv is probably best known for the story that accompanied it, which goes like this. It was put out by Mesorah Press in the late 1980s, and the Cheder in Lakewood decided to send it out as a fundraiser. And if you ever gotten a sefer, I think you do it less often today, but years ago it was more common. You get a sefer in the book in the mail along with an envelope saying like, please send a donation to so and so. So that is what happened. Right? The Cheder in Lakewood sent out my uncle the Netziv together with an envelope saying, please support. About 2 weeks later, that same mailing list got another letter that said, please send the books back. They were sent out in error, and they do not reflect the values of our community. Please send the books back, and we will refund any donation that you might have given. Now, the letter didn't specify what exactly was wrong with this book written by the Torah Tamima, right? The Baruch Alevi Epstein is the author of the Torah Tamima, no slouch himself. So they didn't specify exactly what was wrong with it. There are multiple suggestions out there for what caused that sort of 180. Amongst them are the fact that in the Makor Baruch, it says quite clearly that the Netziv read newspapers. Right? And the newspapers at the time were largely written by maskilim, by more enlightened Jews. Not only did he read them, but he read them on Shabbos. Right? But not only did he read them on Shabbos, Makor Baruch writes that a Shabbos in which the newspapers didn't arrive was for the Netziv like Shabbos Chazon. Right? The Shabbos before Tisha B'Av. I just reporting it. Reporting it as it is. Okay. There is another possibility, though. There is another possibility, which is in that book. There's also a very vivid description of Makor Baruch's aunt. That is the Netziv's first wife, Reina Batya Berlin. Reina Batya Berlin, Lisa, if you don't know Reina Batya, you guys are soulmates. There's a description of Reina Batya, who is the daughter of Rav Itzel of Volozhin, who was the previous head of the yeshiva, and that he described he would walk into their house and she'd be sitting at the dining room table surrounded by her svarim. But unlike Lisa, she was not very happy with her lot in life. It really hit her heart. Right, that she lived in the epicenter of Torah learning, right? But her learning had to happen at the dining room table, right? And she didn't think she should be in the world of the yeshiva. Let's be clear about that, right? But she bemoans a lot of women, right? That this is the way it is, and this is the way that the Torah set it up. What is fascinating is that the English version, my uncle the Netziv, is actually already censored. If you look at the Hebrew version of Makor Baruch in that very same paragraph, you will see that there are svarim mentioned in the Hebrew that didn't make it into the English translation, most notably Mishnah. She had Mishnayos that she was learning, and that was cut out of the English translation. But whether it was because of reading the newspapers, whether it was because of Reina Batya, or the admission that there actually were some secular studies that were taught for a period in the Volozhiner yeshiva, this this book was recalled. That having been said, it helps for us. We have this English version, this English translation is an accurate translation of what Rabbi Naftali, of what the Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein, the Torah Tamima, wrote about his uncle. So this is the first chapter. It's in the 4th volume, but it's the first chapter on his uncle, and he writes as follows. Har Gaon Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv, acronym, spiritual head of the community in Yeshiva of Volozhin, was my mother's brother and also my brother-in-law, having married my sister after the death of his first wife. Born on the eve of Rosh Chodesh Kislev, 1816, in the town of Mir in the Minsk district, he was of average intelligence. And yet, lacking any extraordinary intellectual gift, he nevertheless managed to reach the very highest level of Torah scholarship through his phenomenal, almost unbelievable diligence. It was said that when he felt himself succumbing to sleep after many hours of study, he would place his feet in cold water to keep himself awake. Gedolim, who knew him during his younger years, compared his learning to war, an all-out struggle which he waged with the Torah until he conquered it and claimed it as his own. Because his hard work and learning was not obvious, it took many years until the incredible depths of his knowledge became known. Until that time, he suffered no small degree from the indifference and the condescension of other scholars who relegated him to the status far below their own in the hierarchy of Torah learning. Even his first wife, daughter of Agaon Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin, and granddaughter of the famed Rav Chaim Volozhiner, was depressed and chagrined by her husband's lowly position. She was filled with envy at the honors shown her older sister, wife of the highly acclaimed scholar Hagaon Rav Eliezer Yitzchak Fried, who ever since his youth enjoyed the distinguished position of an Eloi. Even the renowned Rebbitzla did not seem to take too kindly to his son. Okay, so he does not record the story of the shoemaker, but the basic gist of it is there. Right, the basic gist that he was a guy, he was a young kid who wasn't too anything special, right? In fact, was sort of cast aside for his lack of intellectual gifts. Certainly appears in this, which is certainly the most comprehensive biography of sorts, or recounting of the life of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi. Now, you see on the bottom there the cover page, the title page from the first edition of Mikor Baruch, which was published when? You see it down there? 1928 on the famed Ram Press in Vilna, right? 1928. The Netziv passes away in 1893. Okay, so this is 30 years. This is being written 30 years after the Netziv had died. And so if we're talking about the youth, the Netziv's youth, how many years earlier are we talking about? Just 100 years, right? 100 years, right? So while, yes, this comes from his nephew and brother-in-law, it's being put down in writing a long time after it happened. It's not what we would necessarily consider to be a contemporaneous account. If you flip the page, there actually was a biography of sorts that was written about the Netziv in the Netziv's own lifetime. Right now, that already has a different degree, a different status, right, historically speaking, because, of course, you can talk about somebody, if what you've written is rather wrong, you would expect a response, right, to some degree. So if you look at the little paragraph in the top right-hand corner, it says, Rav Kook, the Oto Talmid Yeshivat Volozhin, Pirsem Shnei Ma'amarim al Rabo HaNetziv. That is, Rav Kook, when he was still a student I'm on a page without a page number, page 6. When he was still a student in Volozhin, wrote 2 articles about his Rebbe, the Netziv. Harishon Mamar b'Shem Tzvi Tzadik, Shofia v'Iton Machtiki Adat, V'Lavov Shnat Tafresh Memvav Gilyon Chet, Hasheni Mamar Yeshivat Yitzchaim Shepirsem b'Sefer HaKnesset Tafresh Mem Chet. So that is 1888. So it's the end of the Netziv, towards the end of the Netziv's life. But these 2 pieces were written, and they were written because people were attacking the Netziv for various reasons, and so he was writing a defense of his Rebbe, the Netziv. So if you look down at the second arrow there on the page, the beginning of that paragraph, you will see it says as follows: Od b'yemei ne'urav nir'eh ki ha'ish hazeh ligdulot notzar. Even from his youth, it was obvious that this young man was born for greatness. Born for greatness. And it goes on to describe his commitment to learning, right? His distancing of anything else, solely focused on the world of Torah. No mention here whatsoever of him having been of average intelligence or of some sort of surprising rise, right, to greatness. Okay, is that definitive proof one way or the other? No, but it's an older account than the one of the Torah Tzvi. It's one that was written during his own lifetime, so probably holds a little bit more weight at least than what we had seen from the Torah Tzvi. Right. There was a suggestion about his own memoirs. Right? What did he write about himself? Well, he didn't write memoirs, but we do have the following paragraph that comes from his introduction to his Perush on the She'iltos, which was published in 1861. And remember, the story about the shoemaker, it was generally set at this moment, right? Where he finishes this work, he publishes this work, he has this Seuda, and this is where he shares with people this story about how he was going to be apprenticed to be a shoemaker. Well, what he writes in his introduction is nothing about a shoemaker, but he writes the fact that he's actually upset that he has to publish this work. He wasn't ready to publish it. He was actually afraid copyright law was a hard thing to enforce in the world of 19th century Jewish printing. Right? And sometimes works would get out, right? And they would circulate in manuscript form because you'd give them to somebody to read, to edit, something of that sort. It gets into the wrong hands and somebody will publish it under their own name, right, rather than under yours. So for those types of reasons, the Netziv felt like he had to publish this now, but he was upset that he was doing it, right? Read the first line there. He says, I really wasn't ready. I really didn't want to print this yet. Kasher kain kamus imadi chiburi al hasifrei hakodem bizman ube'amel b'nei haneurim. Why didn't I want to publish this? Because I have another work that I haven't published yet. A 3-volume, rather massive Perush on the halachic medrash called the Sifrei. And I haven't published it yet. I really wanted to publish that one first. But what's the key line in there? He calls this work the work of my youth. This is what I was working on when I was young. If you look at his Perush on the Sifrei, which I spent a long time doing, it is quite an impressive work. Right? Quite an impressive work. Again, often if you have a Sifrei, I'm sure the shul has one. The volume of Sifrei you'll have is the one with the Perush in it. It's a breathtaking work. And this he calls the work of his youth. Okay. Can we define youth? No, not yet. Does that tell us definitively that he was actually some sort of Eloi when he was young? No, but we're getting closer. If we look in this work of his youth, right, we can begin to date the work itself to some degree. These are the kinds of things that we do when we read Torah texts as historians. It's different than what we do when we learn them as lamdanim. And that is particularly kind of the references to Sfarim or the Rashi tables that you generally just skip over if you're just learning, right, the text. Those are the ones where we as historians like to dig in. That gives us some of our historical clues. If you look, it's about, I should have put in a marker there. It's about 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up on the right-hand column. 7 lines up in the right-hand column, you'll see the following line. The line starts Ayin Shin. I'm on page 8, right? The line starts Ayin Shin, and then it says Achar Kotvi Yatsa Mechadash Sefer Emek Halacha Vehevi Rayazu B'Siman Memtes, so on and so forth. After I wrote this, meaning after I finished kind of the body of this work on the Sifrei, a new work was published that has a relevant passage to my discussion here. Well, tell me that a new work was published, and I'm going to say that's a historical clue, right? I'm going to look up when that work was actually first published, and now I can begin to date the body of that work to prior to that publication. So if you flip the page, there's the work, Emek Halacha, that he's referring to. And when was it first published? 1845. How old is he at 1845? He was born in 1860. Is in the room. How old is he? He's 29. Okay, so he's 29. By the age of 29, he has pretty much finished his Perush on the Sifra, right? This massive 3-volume work. Okay, so now we're at least getting into his early 20s, at which point he's already writing something really rather impressive. All right, good. One more quick story. Tsar Nicholas, one of the most ruthless of the Russian czars, engaged in a very deliberate project to try and Russify the Jewish population of what was known today as the Pale of Settlement. Right? To take you back just a few years earlier, the massive Jewish settlement that becomes part of Tsarist Russia was not initially part of Russian territory. Right? It was independent Poland and Lithuania for centuries. And it is until the end of the 18th century, with the partitions of Poland, right, that Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Prussia come in and divide up this land amongst themselves. And the largest piece of it, with the largest Jewish population, becomes part of Russia. So Russia pretty much goes in the 18th century from having 0 Jews to the 19th century, where they have somewhere near 2 million. Right? And it causes a bit of a problem for the Russian rulers. And so there's a whole series of attempts to try to bring Russian Jewry into Russian society. Probably the most famous of them, right, was conscription, was taking young Jewish boys, putting them in the Russian army, right, for several decades. Chances of them coming out still with Jewish allegiance was slim to none. But there were all sorts of other programs that were tried. And in the 1840s, there was a minister of Education, I believe, or the Minister of Interior, I don't remember which one, named Sergei Yuvarov, who is trying multiple different things to try to get the Jewish population of Russia more assimilated into Russian society. One of the things he does is he wants to reform the Jewish educational system. He wants to get the Jewish schools to on board with a system and a program of reform. And so to do so, he identifies a man by the name of Max Lilienthal. Max Lilienthal is a German Jew who had come over to run a school in the German-speaking area of Russia known as Riga. And he was identified by Yuvarov as being a modern German Jew with Enlightenment sensibilities. And so he pegged him to try to be the catalyst for this reforming of Jewish schools in Russia. So the first thing that Lilienthal is charged with doing is to go from town to town and meet with the leaders, the various leaders of the Jewish community, and try to assess the viability of this project, see if they could get them on board. Now, it doesn't work. Right? It doesn't work. Max Lilienthal doesn't last all that long. He does not find fertile ground for his vision of a future enlightened Jewry in Eastern Europe, in Russia. And so he leaves for the shores of the United States, and he arrives in the city of Cincinnati. Now, what do we know about Cincinnati in the 19th century? Anybody? Sorry? HEC. Yes, very good, right? HEC by the end of the 19th century, which it is the birthplace of the American Reform movement. Right? Max Lilienthal becomes a Reform rabbi. And what he will do, though, is in the 1850s, he will write a series of articles for the Israelite, which is the Cincinnati Jewish newspaper, describing these adventures he had in Eastern Europe and how he went from town to town and what happened in each of those places. And so in 1854, this is published. And look at the arrow. He writes as follows. I arrived in Volozhin on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock. It is an unimportant little town, deriving the support of its inhabitants from a large number of Jewish students visiting the renowned yeshiva. Being market day, the streets were exceptionally lively. And I'm accosting the first Jew whom I met. I told him to show me to the house of Rabbi Itzala, that is the head of the yeshiva. Are you the Deutsche Raff? Was the question addressed to me by 100 bystanders. And when answering the affirmative, I saw 50 of them running away in the direction of the rabbi's lodging to inform him of my arrival. My driver followed them, and in 5 minutes afterwards, I alighted to the rabbi's house. I was received by his son-in-law, Rabbi Leibela, a man of some 30 years, and one of the most celebrated Talmudists in Russia. Rabbi Leibela, Leib Hirsch is, in Hebrew, Yehuda Tzvi, right? Or Tzvi Yehuda, Rabbi Naftali, Tzvi Yehuda, Berlin, Rabbi Leibela is the Netziv. He was not a man of 30 years old. He was only, this was 1842, I believe. Right? So he was a man in his young 20s, 1841, actually, I think it was. Right? So he was 25. And how does he describe him? This Reform rabbi who has no skin in the game. How does he describe him? One of the most celebrated Talmudists in all of Russia. Mm-hmm. So already by the age of 25 now, we've established that the Netziv had quite the reputation as a Talmud Chacham, of somebody who is known for his learning. Time is getting late. Let me share with you what I believe to be probably the most convincing argument, that in fact, this story about the Netziv's unheralded beginning probably is not true. And it goes simply as follows. Let me just recount where we are so far, right? So we've said that we've established the Netziv himself was writing a work when he was young, right? That he called the work of his youth. That is a very impressive work of Torah scholarship. We know that that work was pretty much complete already by 1845. We know that prior to that, in 1841, when he was 25 years old, this Max Lilienthal comes, right, and refers to the Netziv as one of those celebrated Talmudists in all of Russia. But how do I know? How can I push it back even earlier than 1825? Than when he was 25? How can I get back into his teens and his youth? Well, simply like this. Why does the Netziv come to Volozhin? No, actually. He comes to Volozhin because he is engaged to the Rosh Yeshiva's daughter. And how old was he when he was engaged to Rosh Yeshiva's daughter? He was 13 years old. He got married at 14. And let me ask you this. If you are the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, the greatest yeshiva in the world at the time, would you have set up a match for your daughter with a shlomazel? The answer has to be no. It has to be. Right? It must be that he at least showed promise as a young man, because there is no way, right, that Rav Itzla Volozhin would have chosen this young man who didn't come from extraordinary wealth or anything of that sort, right, to be the husband of his daughter. So the last question that we need to ask ourselves, though, as historians, is if that's the case, then why does the story emerge? How does it get to be? Where does this come from, right? Why would the story be told as it's told? The answer to that question, I think, is largely here in this family tree. The lines didn't come out, but let me tell the story rather quickly at this point. The Netziv's approach to learning was one of tremendous breadth, tremendous bikius first, right? He needed to know all of Torah first, and be able to take from this piece, right, and connect it to that piece, and connect it to this piece. Even if you learn Hamid Davar today, right, I tell people who learn his Perush on Chumash, you really don't appreciate it if you only learn a particular piece, because what he's saying here connects to something he said there, which connects to something else he said there. And it's only when you see, right, the bigger picture, you begin to really appreciate what he's doing. And that was his way of learning as well. Right? He had tremendous bikius. His approach, though, was already called into question only a few years after he becomes Rosh Yeshiva. The way that things were done in the yeshiva in Volozhny, there was always a Rosh Yeshiva and a Mishneh Lamelech, a second in command. And when the Netziv takes over as Rosh Yeshiva, the second in command is a man by the name of Yosef Ber Soloveitchik. Right? Yosef Ber Soloveitchik is a grandson of Rav Chaim of Volozhny. Yosef Ber Soloveitchik has a very different approach to learning. His learning, as will be the case for his son, Chaim Brisker, his son Chaim Brisker, is one that is very incisive. It's deep, not broad. It's brilliant. It's flashes of brilliance, right? That happen within a limited space. You don't have to learn Kol HaTorah Kula in order to appreciate what Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik has said. And so there were actually groups of students that began to fight already in the 1850s about whether the Netziv really should be the Rosh Yeshiva, or maybe this great Gaon, Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, should actually be the Rosh Yeshiva. So much so that they had to bring a panel of Rabbanim together to sort out the matter, and ultimately decided that yes, the Netziv is supposed to be the Rosh Yeshiva. Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik is supposed to be number 2. It doesn't last for much longer. Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik will become the rabbi in what town? Brisk, the town of Brisk, right? And create his own following there. Years later, his son, Chaim Brisker, will marry the granddaughter of the Netziv, who will come back to Volozhin, right? And he will ultimately become the second in command to the Netziv in the Netziv's older years. Whatever Yosef Ber Soloveitchik had, Chaim Soloveitchik had 10 times that much. And he was fire and brimstone. He was so brilliant, and his approach, right, was so radically different than anything that had become before him. He will shape the future of Lithuanian Torah learning from there on, down to this day. The Brisker method and the Brisker approach to learning is what emerges from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Is the dominant way of learning in Lithuanian yeshivot. It's what excited kids, right? Because it's really hard to first do all of Bikiyas, right? And only then start beginning to imagine Chidushim. But if you can come, all I need is a stira in the Rambam, right? And in my own brilliance to begin to imagine, right, what may account for these two different right, texts. That was something that many more kids could do, right? And you could enjoy it much faster. That becomes the dominant right, way of learning by the time we get to the 20th century. Now, when did the Torah Tamima write his work? When did he put that down in writing? 1928, right? By 1928, the Briskers had taken over. That was the way you learned. And I believe that sort of perspective, that writing back from a world that had become dominated by the Briskers, back to the world of the Netziv lent itself to a very different image of the Netziv. He wasn't brilliant in that way. He didn't have the kind of insights and creativity that the Briskers had. And so therefore, it would make sense, right? That he didn't have the same gifts. What did he have? He had Asmada. He worked hard. He learned all of Tanakh and all of Shas. And, and once he was able to do all of that, he emerged to be the Rosh Yeshiva that he is. But it didn't happen all of a sudden. It wasn't a natural gift. That's where I think. That's where I think it's a hypothesis, accepted or not. But what I do think is pretty clear, though, is that the Netziv was a pretty brilliant young man. Right? And what is undoubtedly true is that he creates and leaves us with quite a legacy. Let me leave you with this. I noted before on the last page that the legacy that he leaves is both within the Torah world and outside the Torah. It's the great minds of the yeshivos, and it's the great minds of universities and the great minds of poetry. And that itself is pretty interesting for a man that didn't have any secular learning, that didn't have any university training. And it raises the question, why? How? Why is Chaim Nachman Bialik taken by the Netziv? Why is Micha Yosef Berdichevsky interested in learning with this Talmud scholar? What was it about the Netziv that attracted this broader audience that made him of interest to people whose interest wasn't only Torah? That's the question we're going to take up next time. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rabbi Rosenzweig. I live in Dallas for a bunch of years. So my brother is
Thank you, Rabbi. No,